we have a list of expectations for us and for our partners. And then if we meet someone who doesn't meet that whole list, we start to think that there's an unlimited resource. The brain thinks you can go on the app or you can go on your phone, you can find 3,000 people before dinner. So you say, well, you're great, but you missed item 19 on my list. So I'm going to go find, and I'm only a little bit sarcastic in when I'm saying this. In fact, we see this happening, that we set our standards so high. The only reason we do that is because the brain is telling us you have more opportunities. The challenge is you get in a loop. We all get in a loop, that we have this sense of an unlimited resource and we keep reaching for our technology or going to the club or saying, well, I'll find someone who meets all 30 items on my list, because surely if it's an unlimited resource, there'll be someone there who meets all my items. And the reality is you're unlikely. In our Singles in America study, we found that over 70% of people have become deeply attracted to someone they weren't initially attracted to. That means that feelings of love and connection, it takes time. It takes first dates, second dates, third dates, deeper conversation. That takes getting to know someone, not showing up with a list.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, you guys, while we know relationships are wonderful, they are also really hard. Many of us believe that they shouldn't be, that if we have good connection and good communication, things will just go smoothly. But it's really that belief that can make us feel stubborn and even more hopeless. So relationships take work. It does for Sue and I. We can make it look easy. It's not. And one of the ways is because many of us, we differ. We differ in what activates us, what makes us feel threat, the expectation, and it's these differences that are held in our body, not our thoughts. And they influence how we talk, how we love, how we fight. So holding that belief, if he or she or they could just understand me, if they love me, they do something different, is not really true. And we're talking about relationships with your partner, your teenager, your mother-in-law. So Sue and I have created an online course that can help you understand yourself and those you love in a different way. This is not just for therapists, it's for everyone. Although the good news is if you're a therapist, you can get CEs along the way, and all of you can use the visuals and the worksheets individually, or you can even use them in your own private practice. So while the course is based on our book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, it is definitely not a replication of the book. We talk directly to you. You learn how to understand more deeply your attachment, those you love, the neuroscience behind it, and how to build secure types of connections right now in your everyday relationships. Rather than changing one another, y'all can shift together in very important ways. It's very powerful. We're getting great reviews. Check it out. It's at therapistuncensored.com/BAS. therapistuncensored.com/BAS. The BAS stands for Beyond Attachment Styles, the Science of Growing Secure Adult Relationships. And by the way, the cost of the course is about the amount of one individual therapy session, and yet you get hours and hours and hours of what we think is extremely valuable information. So check it out.
Hey, everybody. I'm so excited for our guest today. Dr. Justin Garcia is an award-winning evolutionary biologist and is the executive director at the Kinsey Institute. He's chief scientific advisor to Match, where he's led the Singles in America study for 14 years, now with data from over 75,000 people. I definitely want to get into that. And his new book, The Intimate Animal, explores why intimacy, even more than sex drive, is the key to our survival and flourishing. So those of you that follow the podcast, certainly it makes total sense why I would want to bring him on and have him update us on his work. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here with you, and we have so much to talk about.
Yes, I know. I'm really excited. So, okay, you argue that humans evolved for social monogamy. You make a distinction between social monogamy and sexual monogamy. Break it down for us, and let's just jump right into it.
All right, perfect. And this is a theme in my new book, The Intimate Animal. I really focus, this theme carries through so much of how I understand our romantic and sexual relationships. So by training, I'm an anthropologist and evolutionary biologist. And when biologists think about monogamy, we really are always talking about two separate things. One is the relationship structure, And that's what we might call social monogamy. In the case of humans, we experience social monogamy. Only about 3% of mammals do this. So the fact that we even have the architecture in our brains to form romantic bonds is something I think we sometimes take for granted. It takes a particular physiology to be able to do that, to form those intense bonds. About 15% of primates, so our more closely related mammals, do it more often.
But isn't it true that even the allegedly monogamous primates, when given the opportunity, will slip in a little sex here and there? Is that
You
right?
nailed it. Exactly. That's where the challenge is. So social monogamy is the relationship structure, and that's the pair bond. That's that you choose this co-pilot, this co-CEO for life. That's different from sexual monogamy, which is fidelity. And in fact, you're right, Sue, in all of those examples of species that engage in social monogamy, many of them, there's genetic studies that show they're not always faithful sexually, because sometimes they have offspring that are sired by other males or other individuals. So there's a whole biology and evolutionary biology to how we think about our relationship structures and our desires. And I was really interested, I am really interested in how we can understand this desire for deep connection in social monogamy, for these attachment bonds, but then also this other piece of desiring sexual novelty. And there's somewhat different mechanisms in the brain, those for pair bonding and love, and that for sexual excitement. But they're also different evolutionary levers. And what I mean by that is that there were simultaneous evolutionary pressures for forming an intense pair bond, having this person to weather life with. Biologists will talk about pair bonding being important for mutual territory defense, mutual nest building. I've argued that it's really about uncertainty, responding to uncertainty for our ancestors and having someone to do that with. But then also this evolutionary pressure for that variation and having, multiple mates and for offspring, and that drive for novelty. And so much of our relationships are about negotiating the tensions between those two, between love and sex.
I've heard you speak some about all of the different sexual or romantic relational structures. I know that there's a cohort of young adults that imagine that everybody is polyamorous, and if you're not cool. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So we've done some studies, including in our Singles in America study, where we looked at non-monogamy. And researchers use the term consensual non-monogamy. Increasingly, though, some researchers are using terms like negotiated non-monogamy. The reason being because whose consent, or in the 80s, the term ethical non-monogamy was used. People don't use that anymore because whose ethics? So, academics being academics, debating over a word. So in cases of these negotiated non-monogamy, we found about 1 in 5 Americans, 21% in our study, had at some point had some kind of open relationship. Within that, though, there's a lot of diversity, and most don't maintain it forever for long term, but a lot of people try. About 1 in 5 try it at some point. And that could include polyamory, and polyamory is plural love, multiple romantic bonds, but it can also include open sexual relationships, which were a bit more common. And that was where people were, maybe they had an arrangement with their partner where they could have sex with other people. Maybe they weren't totally exclusive yet. Maybe they had an arrangement where they had sex with another person, like threesomes. So we saw that people had a lot of different, whether it was swinging, whether it was totally open relationships, that when you looked at them together, it was a pretty high number, about 1 in 5 at some point doing that. I think it's funny when you bring this up, also the generational expectations of it. And we are starting to see, especially with the young, this expectation that, it's freeing to be in these open relationships. Interestingly, in a new paper that just came out, a new meta-analysis, the satisfaction levels, the levels of relationship satisfaction are exactly the same whether you're in a socially monogamous or an open relationship.
So the young ones that are teasing the more traditional monogamous relationships, you're missing out. That either direction. Some of the things was, used to, you would think that it was about attachment and security, why you wanted to open your relationship up and things like that, and that also bears out not to be true. That you can have just as much insecurity in either kind of relationship or security.
I love that you bring that up. I remember the first time I interviewed a couple that they were swingers and they were in an open relationship. I was doing a biobehavioral study. I was collecting hormone samples. So after I collected some saliva from them for hormone analysis, we're doing this inventory. And I think I had this bias from the previous literature that I was sort of waiting to hear what the deficit was in their relationship. And the more I interviewed them, the more I learned they were filling each other's sentences in. They knew each other's medical history. They explained to me when they opened their relationship and how and what it did for them as individuals and as a couple. And I remember having this moment just thinking, really confronting my own bias as a researcher and just realizing like, oh God, these two are wildly in love. And you're exactly right. Now we know in the literature, more and more studies have shown, yes, it used to be this thought that there were attachment problems or sexual problems when couples open their relationship. That's not the case. We have a better understanding that it's just some people structure their relationships differently. Social monogamy is still by far the most common in the United States and around the globe. It is the predominant pattern, but people structure differently. As an evolution is ever the business of variation of traits, of diversity of traits. So people find ways to respond to their environment, to their ecology, to their partners. So those different structures exist.
So when you say social monogamy, how are you differentiating that from sexual monogamy?
So social monogamy, I'm really thinking of the relationship, the actual relationship, the structure. That's the social behavior. That's what we call pair bond in biology, but that is that you are bonded to another person who you're
A primary attachment.
Primary romantic bonds, primary attachments. And then sexual monogamy is this question of sexual fidelity or sexual exclusivity. And that's where you see that disconnect, because even those, now what's interesting is in most species that form social monogamous bonds, they try to encourage sexual fidelity in their partnership. So they don't typically want their partners mating with others. I remember I used this one story in the book, in The Intimate Animal, that I was watching red-winged blackbirds, who a lot of birds will pair monogamously for a mating season. And the male flew away, and then there was another male with this female. And when he came back, the two males grappled each other. They fell in the reeds. Only one came out. One of them died in this fight. And biologists so often say Mother Nature is red in tooth and claw. And it was just this reminder of the intensity of, they were socially monogamously bonded. The female was trying to mate with the neighbor, but her partner didn't like it, and he fought another male over it. So you see those dynamics in other species. They're similar to the dynamics we see in humans.
Another thing that I had learned, related to polyamory and just non-traditional sexual agreements, that something stood out to me. I believe it was Fisher that had done a lot of research. Was she part of Kinsey as well?
She was. And in fact, Dr. Helen Fisher, the anthropologist, in fact, not everyone can see it, but Sue can see the screen behind me. The gibbons behind me, it's sculpture of gibbons. They're socially monogamous. Those were Helen Fisher's mother created them, and they're part of her.
I noticed them right away. I love them.
Yeah.
They're beautiful. Oh my God.
Good reminder, my friend and collaborator.
But something just really stood out to me when she was talking about before they would do fMRIs and they were looking at couples that were in love. I think this is what she said, was that how they knew if they were in love or not was they would ask questions to elicit jealousy. If they were like, that they would consider that not being in love. But these days, with various forms, jealousy is something that they see very differently. So I was just curious about your thoughts. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. And the way that psychologists, behavioral scientists will often think of romantic love is we'll use terms like focused attention, intrusive thought, obsessive thinking. And part of that is what biologists use the term mate guarding. We can think of it as jealousy, that you kind of you try to have that exclusivity. You bring up such a big point, and I think particularly in couples that have agreements about open relationships, the question is not whether they can extinguish jealousy. I think we know that from several studies, jealousy is there, but how it's managed. And the way it's managed is through a lot of communication and a lot of trust of, okay, we're going to have other partners, but here's how we're going to do it. And here are the limits. Here are what. And different couples have different agreements. Some want a don't ask, don't tell agreement. Like when you're traveling, do what you do. Be safe. You have to use condoms. You have to use protection, contraceptives. Some couples have agreements like that. Others want to know. Some want to be there. Some say not with friends. Some say not more than one time. So there's a lot of diversity. And I think this question of jealousy, I was just talking to a colleague of mine about this question of infidelity in consensually non-monogamous relationships, because you can still have infidelity. You can still have betrayal. And that's where jealousy can emerge. So it's not that it suddenly goes away. It's that your rules are different. And how do you negotiate them in a way that you trust each other? So I think to your point is a great study. We got to do this study now. What you're looking for, what it is that elicits jealousy, is perhaps you have to really hone in on what's betrayal to you and to your relationship.
So many people have tried it. And then what ends up happening based on your data?
Yeah, so we see that a pretty high number have tried it. A lower number appear to be currently in negotiated non-monogamous relationship. And I think that tells us that more people try it than they say this is the structure. This is a lifelong structure that works for me. And I say that without sort of moral judgment around it, as a behavioral observation that there's different questions of why that is. So some people would say, well, there's a lot of social pressure. There's a lot of social pressure to be in a relationship with one person. If you're going to have kids, there's pressure to have two parents, not multiple parents. How you live together, what are the tax codes, how do you have health insurance? That we're structured around a society that's what people would say is mononormative, the expectation of having one partner. So there's a camp of people who would argue that that's why you see that drop off from who try it to who stay there. That same group would maybe argue that that's also why the number is 1 in 5 and not 1 in 2, for instance, the social pressure. Then there's another camp of researchers who would say, well, what's so interesting about humans is our sexual lives are really flexible. We experiment, we try things, particularly at different points in our life, particularly when you're young. You were saying about the young earlier, when you're not necessarily thinking about reproduction and marriage and families yet, and most certainly in North American context. But then comes through these patterns that our species has had for 4 million years. And that's you start to typically hone in on forming an intense pair bond, usually with one person at a time. Because it can be kind of hard for the brain and hard for behavior, hard for socially to really manage more than one intense bond at a time, romantic bond. So researchers still disagree on that, on whether what's really driving it. Is it our neurobiology? Is it social structure? Is it culture? What I really like to do is say, well, it's all of it. And we don't necessarily need to tease it apart and pretend that they're happening in isolation. We are an organism in a social context. For the entirety of our species' existence, we've been in social context. So evolutionary process happens in culture and it happens in our physiology. And they're working in tandem all the time.
You had mentioned before we got on about doing some work with Esther Perel. And I was thinking about this conflict between, it sounds like what I'm understanding is that we are driven to have a primary person. You said co-pilot. They were driven to have a co-pilot, yet also that's different than sexual fidelity. So a middle-aged woman in a long-term relationship, what does that mean for her and people like her?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting thinking about Esther Perel's work in Mating in Captivity. It's 20 years this year. It's his 20th anniversary, which is hard to believe. And similar themes that she wrote about this of where we kind of maintain eroticism in our relationships and the tensions that can be there. I think we're in some ways similar things that we're thinking about. And throughout life, one of the things actually Perel says that I really love in Mating in Captivity is this idea that if you're in a long-term relationship with someone, there'll be different seasons of that relationship. And I think that's an important way that we can think about if you have that primary attachment bond and it's a romantic and sexual attachment bond, but also recognizing that a relationship changes at different points in life because of kids, because of age, because of hormones, because of
menopause.
Menopause, exactly. That we go through these different parts of our life. One way I think about relationships in a lot of my research is there's 3 entities in a relationship at every time. There's me, there's you, and there's us. And there are parts of our lives where maybe I'm changing, and I have to recognize that the us is going to change in some ways too. And when we start to think of those 3 different moving pieces, or maybe you're changing and I'm not ready to change, but you're changing and you're dragging the us to change as well. So how we meet those changes. And I was telling you, my wife and I just welcomed our first baby. And that's a big change. It's a huge change for a couple. And it changes your relationship. It changes your sex life. It changes your communication. It changes your sleep patterns and how you negotiate that, how you meet that. Menopause and midlife I haven't gotten to your question yet. Sorry. But to your point about midlife.
It's just fun to talk. So
Yeah.
Go for it.
The midlife one is interesting in part because of what's going on biologically, physiologically, and particularly for women with premenopause and menopause and then postmenopause. Increasingly, researchers talk about the menopausal transition because it's a long period of physiological change. Interestingly, in one of our studies, and several studies we've done, we've looked at aging and sexual activity and aging and relationships. And what we find is that as we age, sexual frequency decreases. That's been known in the literature. Although, if you control for medication use, you don't get as sharp of a decline. So, a lot of the decline in sexual frequency with age, particularly in men, is associated with cardiovascular drugs, which medications they need, but they have side effects, or other kinds of antidepressants. A lot of medications have sexual side effects. But on average, we get a decline in sexual frequency. But here's the interesting part. Particularly for women, frequency was going down, but satisfaction wasn't going down. And in another study where we specifically honed in on orgasm, we found sexual activity had decreased, but women, as they were aging, were still enjoying sex and, in fact, had a slight uptick in their orgasm rates right around menopause. So I think there's a lot to be said about as we age, we start to think about sex differently. We might engage in it less frequently. But then there's these questions of quantity over quality. And particularly for women, as they're getting older, what we think is happening is they are having slower sex and there's more foreplay, partly because the body's changing and reduced vaginal lubrication, thinning of the vaginal wall. So they're maybe having more foreplay, more oral sex, more slower sex, using lubricant. Things that as a sex researcher, I think, if you had used lubricant 20 years ago, you'd be having higher orgasm rates. But we have these moments that we meet, in this case, menopause for many women, where you kind of pushes you to then say, okay, now it's time to use a product. Now it's time to have more foreplay. Whereas sex therapists would say, 30 minutes of foreplay always. And so I'm optimistic about increasing our work on aging, but we're finding a lot of happy things in the data.
Totally. It makes me also think about the trend too of being less self-conscious, but also like starting HRT medications. And this might be an example of the reverse of that, like you said, lubrication or whatever it is, finally giving your body something that then spikes it instead of has it go down. I love news like this.
Yeah. Yeah. This is optimistic.
That's very
optimistic.
optimistic.
And then we understand more. And on the HRT pieces, we understand more and more. My colleague, Dr. Lauren Stryker, as an OBGYN, has been speaking a lot about this issue we're understanding more and more about the studies on HRT in later life and menopause. And I remember when everyone was so worried about cancer rates with HRT, and those studies are getting overturned. I mean, new data is telling us more nuances. It's safer than people thought. There's ways that we have benefits for our sexual lives and our relationships as the more we research these things and understand it.
It's wonderful. And when you're talking about frequency of sex and sexuality and things like that, do you make distinctions between sex with a partner versus masturbation? And, can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a really important point that you bring up, because one of the things my whole career I've been interested in. Early in my career, I was writing a lot about hookup behavior and hookup culture and casual sex. But what I was really interested in was the relationship context of sexual activity and how people were negotiating intimacy in these different contexts. So looking for a loving bond, what about a hookup? What about infidelity? What about long-term relationships? And part of this question of context also means, what about when you're solo, when you're by yourself? What about with a partner that you desire? What about a partner that you don't know? What about transactional or sex worker case? So all of those are really important. And increasingly in sex research, particularly our work here at the Kinsey Institute, we are asking questions about the context of people's sexual lives. And the point of solo sex or masturbation that's interesting, in one of our studies on COVID during the COVID pandemic, we found decreases in sexual frequency at the very start of the pandemic. We did a big study, like what was the impact of COVID on love and sex. We saw decreases. The question was, well, is that because everyone was freaked out about, they don't want to kiss someone or touch someone? But we also found decreases in masturbation. And what that told us is that, well, we're picking up on some signal that desire has gone down, that people were worried about engaging in sexual activity in that particular moment. Because when you see both partnered sex decrease and masturbation decrease, it's not just that I was worried about touching someone who could be infected. It was that I just wasn't interested in sex. And one model that we use here, so Stephen Porges is on our faculty, who writes a lot about the polyvagal theory, his work, and we think a lot about sexual activity in terms of, do people feel safe? And during the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of people had this physiological threat to the environment and what was happening. Well, that's not conducive to sexual activity. And one way I've sometimes worded it is, you'll never see two gazelle mating in front of a lion in the natural world. And you wouldn't stop to kiss someone in a burning building. When our nervous systems are in a threat response, it's not conducive to social behavior. It's not conducive to any kind of mating behavior, whether that's romantic bonds or sexual activity.
Yeah, when your threat response system is going, it's not sexy.
Yeah, exactly.
And if I feel okay and your threat response system is going, still not sexy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, this anxious person, I'm not too turned on by them right now. Yeah.
Yeah, there is something about safety in that. That's really interesting. Dopamine. You had talked about dopamine, oxytocin, some of the neuroscience behind these pair bondings, and you have some good data on that.
Yeah, I've studied dopamine a big part of my career. Less so now. I used to do more behavior genetics work and particularly worked on a suite of genes, DRT2, DRT4. They were dopamine receptor genes. So we were looking at not when people produce dopamine, but how it gets received in the brain. In fact, when people have problems with production of dopamine, usually you see it in pretty significant clinical conditions.
So can we just slow down for just a second? So dopamine being, just for folks that are kind of new to this, sometimes we can just get excited and go so fast. Dopamine being a neurotransmitter that does what?
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's associated with a few things in our physiology, but in particular the pleasure systems, what are called the pleasure circuits in the brain. And what that really is, it's about reward.
I always think of it like seeking.
Sensation seeking is the term, exactly. And what's interesting about dopamine, some people will say it's this pleasure system, but in fact, what it really is, it's for future reward. It's why it's highly linked to gambling and particularly addictive to gambling, because it's this idea that you have a future reward. So we see dopamine activates with sexual behavior, with alcohol use and drug use, with gambling behavior. Some of the things can be more challenging, but it's that reward pathway in our brain. But it also has some other functions. So people who have a dopamine production issue, for instance, is one of the conditions that Parkinson's is associated with, one of physiologically what's happening. And interestingly, there was a study years ago that some Parkinson's patients take an L-DOPA medication. There was a study years ago that about 1 in 10 will develop gambling problems because there's a finite number of neurotransmitters and peptides and hormones, and sometimes you activate it for one therapeutic reason, and you can have an unexpected outcome. It's sort of the opposite of what we see for antidepressant medications. Antidepressant medications can uplift you and you feel social again, but because of the part of the brain that they're addressing, you get a lot of sexual side effects. So you can have these multiple things, a finite number of things in the brain, which I'm talking to you. Of course, you know this better than anyone.
Well, and one of the things that I like about and thinking about it is that we're not supposed to have a bunch of dopamine or a bunch of serotonin, or that it's like pistons that kind of work together. And when I think of romantic love, long-term romantic love, I think of that combination of dopamine and oxytocin together as your money that you're going for right there,
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to be totally in one world or the other. And oxytocin in that sense, so oxytocin is a neuropeptide that is associated with bonding. And we often think about oxytocin in maternal-child relationships. So it's important. It's actually important for breastfeeding. It's associated with milk letdown. It's associated with uterine contractions. So a lot of women will get Pitocin, which is synthetic oxytocin, during labor. But it's also involved in the brain in bonding behavior, also associated with orgasm. Oxytocin has some interesting things that it's associated with: positive touch and massage. That's why sometimes it's called the cuddle hormone. And what's interesting,
gaze.
yes.
And by the way, if folks are interested in this, I did sit down with Sue Carter, who is the pioneer related to oxytocin. And so we have a whole interview with her that we can link in the show notes.
Yes, and Sue is wonderful. Is a good friend of mine. Sue was the director of the institute before me, and a brilliant, brilliant scientist. And her work on oxytocin, both in humans and in voles, in two different species of voles. Interestingly, montane voles and prairie voles, where one species is socially monogamous and the other is not. And that has to do with how oxytocin is structured, and the difference in how oxytocin is structured in the brain, including the density of the receptors, and how that's associated with the evolution of pair bonding. So we know exactly, Sue, that there's these different pieces, these different mechanisms that are associated with the physiology of bonding. And increasingly, folks like Sue Carter and others have argued that oxytocin is partly tied to the immune system. There have been these amazing studies, for instance, laboratory studies on wound healing. And people with higher levels of oxytocin, their wounds heal faster. That's why Sue will say that love is the best medicine. And there's some really interesting biological evidence that it in fact is.
So that's a great plug for, this idea that we promote on the podcast about learning how to regulate your nervous system and stay in your ventral vagal. We call it the green zone. That's what we're calling secure relating. And so secure relating literally is good for your body.
It is. Yeah, your physical health, your mental health, your ability to respond to your environment. I mean, it's so good for your body.
Quick question before we go back to dopamine. Suddenly I started seeing these oxytocin supplements pop up. What are your thoughts about those?
Oh gosh, I'm going to have some company call me and be upset. So there are supplements. There's also, for a while, there has been this intranasal oxytocin that you... the thing about oxytocin is it has a pretty quick chemical half-life. There are certain things that the body gets a very high dose, a pulse of oxytocin with birth, with sex.
With gaze. I always want to say gaze because it's easy to do. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Eye gaze to another. So we can get these bursts of it. There's a lot of evidence that the best oxytocin is actually behavioral. So if you want a burst of oxytocin, engage in eye gazing with someone, hug someone that you love, like you get such a higher dose than you could stimulate. I mean, there's synthetic oxytocin's been around for a long time. That's what Pitocin is. Women might get in the hospital. I'm always a little bit cautious about when we use it for behavioral effects and what we think is going to happen, and sometimes the unintended consequences. I'm always a little cautious about tinkering with our evolved physiology. Although a funny story, I don't think I've ever publicly shared this story. Helen Fisher and I, years ago, there was a product that you could spray yourself with oxytocin, and it was supposed to make people trust you more. And someone had sent it to her, and I had just gotten to her house. We were going to go out for dinner in New York, and we were like, do you think it works? And we were talking through this exact science. I said, it's got a really quick half-life. I don't know. It might have a lot of alcohol. And I didn't know. We were sort of theorizing on whether it worked. So we doused each other in this liquid oxytocin. And then we ran out of the house to a restaurant. And the two of us were hysterical laughing, saying, you think the waiter is being more friendly? I think the maitre d' was being really extra friendly. We're walking down the street and just saying hi to people as we're walking.
So is that placebo, or was that was it working? Because y'all were having a great time.
Years later, we would joke it was placebo, but we wanted it to be true. But it's interesting about how increasingly people or companies are trying to tap into this. The challenge is there's still so much we don't understand really about the specifics of these mechanisms and the complications of these mechanisms. In the case of oxytocin, what Sue Carter's work also shows us, yes, you can have ramp up of oxytocin, but oxytocin is operating almost always in concert with vasopressin. So there's another hormone in the brain that they're kind of dancing in how they interact. And if you ramp up one without the other, you can unintentionally get high rates of aggression.
Like jealousy. Speaking of jealousy,
yeah,
where you protect your tribe.
Exactly. People who study aggression, the biology of aggression, there's two types. There's defensive aggression, which we sometimes think of as protecting. And then there's offensive aggression, which is, I want to claim that territory. I want that. But the defensive aggression, biologists often joke, there's nothing more dangerous in the natural world than a mother bear. And defensive aggression can be quite intense. In fact, offensive aggression, when two males compete for a mate, they often don't want to fight to the death. They do a lot of showing their aggression. They often go. Defensive aggression, you could fight to the death. That's why a mother bear is so dangerous. It's a different physiological cascade that you experience.
Oh, there's something so... I just got chills when you said that. That feels so true. And including even the showboating and the chest beating and that it's purposeful, but it's different than when you've lost your mind because somebody's coming after your kid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As therapists, Sue and I both know the powerful impact of therapy. Well, we all do, or you wouldn't be a listener of Therapists Uncensored. But sometimes we need more, and finding a psychiatrist, especially one that's well qualified and has availability, can be so hard. It's common to be on a waiting list for months. And with so much going on in the world, Sue and I am so glad we've discovered Talkiatry. Talkiatry is 100% online psychiatry. You see a medical provider who does comprehensive evaluations, diagnosis, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, OCD, and more. So, what I love is that all of their clinicians, while they're well trained and are in network with major insurers. So, you can use your existing insurance instead of paying either monthly prescriptions or the high out of network fees. So, you have access to experienced, licensed psychiatrists. They're going to take the time to do a personalized treatment plan and, if right, prescribe medications that's right for you. Good news is getting started only takes moments. You complete a short online assessment and it helps you get matched with, again, the clinician that meets your needs, schedule, and insurance. And guess what? You can be seen in days, not months. So to get started, head to talkiatry.com/TU, complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. So that's Talkiatry, TALKIATRY.com/TU to get matched in minutes. Okay, let's jump back in.
Okay, I keep distracting us, but I know that there's some exciting dopamine news here.
Oh, that's right. Oh, so we're having too much fun.
I also think about just to set aside and thank you for your answer about the oxytocin. And I want to say that, like, even dopamine, there's all this optimization stuff, even about dopamine. And I love the message of kind of don't mess with Mother Nature. You didn't say that directly, but the endogenous systems work really well. And learning about them is the best way to facilitate them versus something that we're trying to manipulate it too directly.
Exactly. And I'm laughing because we're talking about, we keep trying to circle back to dopamine, but we're having such a dopamine rush, we can't get back to dopamine.
That's true.
We're having fun.
We're about to get there.
Yeah. On the dopamine systems, what we've seen in sexual activity, so genital stimulations associated with dopamine, and some of our work on these dopamine genes, where we're looking at the receptors. So people vary on how their brain can receive dopamine, on how once it's produced and it's in the synapses between cells, then how the rest of the brain gobbles it up. So we found people with a long variant of this gene, DRD4. They were the ones that didn't gobble up the dopamine as fast. Their receptors had more proteins on them. They engage in more sensation-seeking behavior. People with long alleles are more likely to engage in alcohol use and abuse. We found that they were more likely to engage in infidelity. And when they engaged in infidelity, they actually did it 50% more often. So that told us that this dopamine system was also tapping into our sexual behaviors. And in that case, I think the issue with infidelity was it's sensation-seeking and it was risk-taking. There's an element of risk that was associated with. And we did an interesting thing in the one study. We controlled for delayed discounting, the control for like other forms of risk. And there seemed to be something unique about the sort of, I'm cautious about calling it sexual risk, but the sexual sensation-seeking that some people were engaging in. So we understand more and more that dopamine is also playing some interesting roles in what our sexual behaviors look like.
I know some people are saying, like, oh no, what if my partner has this allele? But then I wanted to be able to go into more detail about this idea of longevity and passion over time, and if there's exceptions to that.
So to wrap up on the dopamine front, and the other part of dopamine that we know is involved, as we were saying, are these studies on romantic love. So particularly when people were put in the brain scanner, we were talking about the jealousy piece. The other thing in those studies were people were put in an fMRI who were romantically in love, shown pictures of their beloved, and you see the ventral tegmental area. You see the part of the powerhouse parts of dopamine in the brain really activating. And that suggests that when we're in love, that the brain is treating that almost like an addiction, but it's treating it as a reward. So when you say you can't wait to get home to your beloved or you're thinking about them, you actually have this reward process. But there's a catch, and there's a catch that I know we're going to talk about long-term relationships, that there's some evidence that you can have sexual habituation. And that's that you can get this reward, but over time, much like you can habituate to other things, including drugs, that you need a little novelty to it. So what's interesting about that, it aligns with what we see in a lot of the research studies on long-term couples. So those couples that maintain passion over time, they're often doing things that introduce novelty into the relationship in the context of their partner. Sometimes it's novelty in the bedroom. Let's try something new. Sometimes it's novelty. We take a vacation somewhere new every year. Sometimes we try a new restaurant. We read a new book. But we know from a number of studies, including some of ours here at the Kinsey Institute and in my lab, that long-term couples having some novelty, because you're firing that other lever So social monogamy being the one, the pair bond, you're getting the novelty without necessarily having to look for other partners. You're getting the novelty in the context of your relationship. And we know a lot of people are looking to maintain passion and connection in their relationship, not necessarily other partners. Some people do find other partners and that works for them. But for many people, it's how do we cultivate that stoke those flames? So I often like to think about that because it doesn't always have to be expensive. You don't have to go to a new place in the Caribbean every year. You can try to take a different walk every day after dinner, go down a different street, try a different park, cook something new, but introducing some novelty. The brain is craving it. So where you can find ways to do it with your partner in a partnership can be a powerful aphrodisiac of having some of that.
It's like falling in love again.
Yeah, exactly.
But you've got to bring something to the table. You can't just sit back and say you're bored and you're bored with your partner and expect that to change anything.
Yeah, and what do you do to try to work through that boredom together? And that takes negotiation and conversation. But I do think it's something when we understand how the brain is managing our social relationships, it's something we can do. We can do something about it.
And to look at, am I boring? Am I bringing anything? You know what I mean? Like versus just, what is this person doing for me? Like, what am I bringing?
It's so easy. It's so easy to get into a routine. You go to work, you come home, you have dinner, you go to bed. And where can you introduce that? And sometimes it's sexually, sometimes it's, just we're going to do something totally different to eat tonight, or we're going to, just a little bit of novelty can be so exciting. Okay, so that's some of the stuff we've been looking at on relationships. What we see, and it was really fun for me I tried to unpack this in the book and also talking through some of our studies. So with my colleague, Dave Frederick, we did a series of studies that Dave led on what keeps passion alive in long-term couples, long-term relationships. And what we found, first we looked at the heterosexual sample. Then we looked at a separate sample of gay men and then a separate sample of lesbian women. There was so much data, we broke it up into these.
And is there any gender variant here, any trans?
Not in those studies. So for some of our studies, it's a little challenging for us. We have published more on gay men, lesbian women, and straight men and women, and bisexual men and women. Sometimes we don't have enough numbers. We just don't have enough of a sample size. So people can do qualitative work. Some of the questions we're looking at, you need enough data, and just we haven't had it that often. But there is some really interesting work coming out on that, including on questions of sexual satisfaction for gender diverse people and trans people, especially in cases. So historically, for instance, we would think of trans women as their sexual lives were complicated by the fact that if they had surgery to the genitals and they couldn't lubricate. That's changing. There's new surgical techniques that with hormones, trans women can lubricate. And the other thing that often doesn't get talked about in trans medicine or when we think of trans people, there's a wide diversity of what it means to be trans and what kind of hormones if you're on hormones, what kind of hormones, if you have surgery, what kind of surgery, if you have a particular type of surgery, what technique is used, how well it worked. So there's just so much diversity there that particularly when you're talking about sexual behavior, then if you try to tease that apart, you really need a focused study working with trans people. Some of my colleagues around the world are doing that. We have less data on that. We have more on cross-sexual orientations. Like we did a study on orgasm and sexual orientation, in part because, now I'm being a little ADD, in 1966, Masters and Johnson had made this claim in one of their books that basically straight men could learn an awful lot from lesbian women. And it sounds right, but we were like, let's test it. We can test this. So in one of our studies, we looked at orgasm rates across sexual orientations. And we found for men, there were not big differences whether you were gay, straight, or bisexual. But women, lesbian women orgasmed at much higher rates than straight women, heterosexual women. But what was interesting to us is that bisexual women had some of the lowest rates of orgasm. And that's surprising because in most of the previous studies, bisexual women had the strongest arousal responses. So they had stronger arousability. But why were their orgasm rates lower? Well, in the first study, we weren't controlling for their partners, whether their partners were male and female, and whether they were preferred partners. So you could be bisexual, but then also why and when you're engaging in sexual activity. But that was interesting that lesbian women had the highest rates. We replicated that in another study. As one of my colleagues said, is maybe men are bad for women's orgasms. But I think it has to do a lot about communication. Lesbian women have more of a turn-taking culture in their sexual lives. They engage in a lot more oral sex. They engage in more foreplay. They engage in more communication. all of those we know are great ingredients for orgasm and pleasure. So in our passion studies, what we found was something similar, actually. In the one study with Dave Frederick, I think we had about 50,000 people in the sample. And the paper was a great title, What Keeps Passion Alive? What we found were a suite of things. Some were sexual, oral sex, and kissing. Actually, kissing is very powerful. And communication was another set. So more communication associated with passion. And then the third group of behaviors were what I would call intentionality. And that was mood lighting, mood setting, lighting candles, reading magazines for sex tips. It wasn't about the actual tips you got in the magazine. It wasn't about the smell of the candle. It was more saying, I'm going to go out of my way to prioritize a sexual event in my relationship. Those couples that did that said, I'm going to light this candle, I'm going to dim the lights. It's important that I'm honoring the role of sex in our relationship. They had higher passion, including 10, 20, 30-year relationships had higher passion. Okay, the other part of your question, I haven't answered yet. I'm having so much fun, Sue. The other part that I didn't answer.
You're keeping up. I'm impressed.
Yeah, is what about cross-sexual orientations. So we looked at the lesbian women and gay men sample. We found remarkably similar patterns across sexual orientations. But what we found was frequency of sexual activity higher in gay men. But in women, they had a very quick drop-off in sexual frequency in the longevity of the relationship. Some people have sometimes had called this lesbian bed death.
Don't say it.
I know, I hate the term. We hated the term. We actually ripped the term apart in the paper. You'll be proud of us.
Good, okay.
And in part because we said everyone's got bed death, and this idea that there's something unique to lesbian women. But here was the catcher. So frequency had this faster drop-off, but they were reporting increases in satisfaction. So again, I think it was this obsession about sexual frequency as opposed to the question we're interested in. What about the quality? What about the satisfaction you're deriving from it? What about its impact on your relationship? Those things in lesbian women we were seeing actually increases with time. But frequency, and in that case, it was that the slope was faster. The frequency dropped off a lot faster. So we really were like, that is, we never want to hear this term again, because really it was lesbian intimacies that we were seeing in the data that were profound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like almost like a male eye on it, and then it just looks like death. If you're not having sex, then it's dead.
Yeah, right. But it was growth in a lot of ways. It was just what was the measure, frequency or quality? So that was what we were finding in those studies, and we're continuing to explore more and more of those. One of the great things is we have a lot of big data sets, so we can look across sexual orientations and age. I'm getting more, maybe because I'm getting older, I'm getting more and more interested in. And age is not, there's really a limited research on how we understand love and sex across the entire life course. So it's been a lot of fun. One more piece that we parked. Should we come back to the Kinsey scale? So we were talking about sexual orientations and these different findings. So here at the Kinsey Institute, we often think about the Kinsey scale for sexual orientation. Dr. Kinsey and colleagues in their early work in the 1930s and 40s, including the first book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male in 1948, second book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953, talked about this scale for sexual orientation, with 0 being exclusively heterosexual and 6 being exclusively homosexual, and that people were on a sliding scale. What was interesting is in the early study, Kinsey was a zoologist, he was a taxonomist. So people were assigned a score based on how many male sexual partners, female sexual partners, male sexual fantasies, female sexual fantasies. Today, we think of it much more as identity. Like, where would you place yourself on a sliding scale of 0 to 6? What I liked about it is I think because Kinsey was a zoologist, in the natural world, everything's on a continuum. Traits are always there's always variation in traits. And I think that idea that sexual orientation was on a continuum comes from someone who thinks about the natural world and how traits exist. One of the things we do today in sex research that's a little bit different is we sometimes use scales in studies like that, but we often separate your sexual behavior, your sexual identity, and your sexual preference. And because at times those three can be operating differently. You could say I'm exclusively heterosexual, or I'm bisexual, I'm homosexual, I'm gay or lesbian. But sometimes your behaviors don't always align. So, for instance, in the United States, we see, when we look at the number of men who identify as gay, there's a much higher number of men who have had a sexual event with another man in the last year than who identify as gay and bisexual. And those are men who say they're heterosexual, but they're exploring, or they're heteroflexible, or let's say you're in prison and you maybe fully identify as straight, but your behavior isn't going to align perhaps with your identity, and maybe not even align with your preference. So we really think about those different pieces of where people are in their life course at different times. Or in the research, a lot of people who are gay and lesbian at some point have had heterosexual partnerships because it's kind of compulsory. They were expected to in their development. So increasingly, we try to tease those apart and understand the constituent parts.
Are you familiar with the heated rivalry craze right now?
I am, and I hate to say this. I haven't watched it yet, and only because we have an infant at home. I haven't had a chance to. We haven't watched TV much in the last few weeks.
You'll love it. It'll be so interesting
I can't wait.
because it's making some of your points very much around the difference between identity and behavior and orientation. But you're saying that now what you do is you ask people to just self-identify based on those three things. Is that right?
Yeah, so we might ask them, like, what in your own orientation, where do you sit on this scale? And then what are your behaviors? How many male sexual events, female sexual events have you had in the last year? And then we might say, well, what's your preference? In the best case, what kind of partners would you ideally like to have? What kind of sex would you like to be having right now? And then we will sometimes tease that apart. There was also a researcher, Fritz Klein, had what was called the Klein sexual orientation grid, and that did something similar, breaking down those different parts.
Well, I can't wait for you to see the show because what's particularly interesting is why it is just taken off and it is a phenomena. And I'm just curious about that, right? That like, what is it that it's so sex forward, but people across all the spectrums are just enamored and loving it and rewatching it and saying the lines with them. And so it really is kind of interesting about what it's tapping into culturally there was a hunger for, there was a need for.
Yeah. And I think there's been other movies and shows, particularly in the last few years, that similarly are kind of tapping into these questions about how we think about sexualities today, are, I think, increasingly recognizing there's a flexibility to our sexual behaviors and sexualities. And in the midst of that, for my work, my interests are how we're negotiating our desires for intimacy in the mix of all that. How are we negotiating our desire for relationships, but also for sexual exploration? I think as we start to look at both of those together and how people are looking for love and looking for sex and what kind of structure they want in a relationship and what kind of partners they want, long-term, short-term, there's just so many more research questions to ask.
You studied singles. I'm very, very interested in this. So I guess why don't you just first give us your highlights about what you understand, anything new that you really want to call attention to?
Yeah, so we do a big project called Singles in America, big research study. We started in 2010. So we were collecting our 15th year of data. We skipped 1 year with the pandemic. And with the late, great Helen Fisher, and then also with my colleague Amanda Gesselman, a psychologist here at Kinsey Institute, brilliant psychologist, studies couples and sexuality. We've been looking at singles, and this is a project we do with Match, with the dating company who fully funds our study. And studying singles is really interesting. There's over 100 million singles in the United States today. That's around 40% of the adult population. And increasingly, we're seeing in other developed countries large numbers of the adult population who are single. This is historically unprecedented. As an evolutionary scientist, this is so different from our ancestors to see so many adults who are single. Especially just a few decades ago, singles were typically thought of as you would partner pretty early on in your life. And if you were singles, maybe because it was late in life and you were a widow or a widower and lost a partner. The idea
or there was something wrong with you that you weren't partnered.
Something wrong with. I love that you bring that up because, in fact, people often have these ideas that it was women who were judged harshly if they were single, this idea of the spinster. Turns out men were also judged harshly if they were single. If you were a man in the 1950s, in your 30s or 40s, and you were single and you went to get a bank loan, no way. Bank wouldn't give you a loan because there's two things that are going on with people who are singles. There have been a series of studies by sociologist Bella DePaula who look at what she calls singleism, and that's stigma towards singles. It's changing more and more today. But if you're single too long, the idea is that what psychologists and sociologists think are the one reason you're single because there's something wrong with you and you don't want to partner off. So you get judged for that because you say, oh, you're not engaging in normative behavior. You don't want to engage in normative behavior, so there's something wrong with you. Or you're not engaging in this partnering because you can't, because people don't want to partner with you, so there's something wrong with you. So either way, you experience this stigma for not engaging in what you're expected to. And in fact, so much of our lives are built around this idea of forming a partnership, of tax codes and everything about social life.
Well, but even your research is saying that we're kind of driven towards that related to the social monogamy.
Yeah, I think we're very much driven for looking for partnerships. So on top of that, there's sort of social pressures for engaging in those. So we're even really trying to understand what is the experience of these single adults, of single people, as they move in and out of romantic and sexual relationships. So a lot of my work's on the on ramps when we get into these relationships, and then the off ramps as we get out of them. And we've been doing a lot of stuff on their attitudes and behaviors, including, what are singles today looking for? And maybe I'll mention something we just found in a study. Actually, we released it today, so I haven't had a chance to talk to anyone else about it yet. So
Whee!
I'll get back to you. We just looked at a sample, and particularly for Gen Z, what we found was that a lot of them want to be in a relationship. A lot of Gen Z people reported, I think it was a little over 80%, so that they wanted to be in a relationship. But then somewhere around 55% said that they didn't think that they were ready for a relationship. And this is where I really love being with you, because you have the clinical expertise that I don't. So I think what we're seeing more and more, particularly for young people today, is they're saying they want these bonds. They want the safety and comfort and pleasure and satisfaction of a relationship, but they don't feel they have the skills, or they don't feel they're prepared to get into these relationships. So there's this mismatch that we're starting to see in our data, particularly on singles. And I almost sometimes worry, are we leaning too much into this idea that you need to be perfect, that you need to work on yourself before you can find love, and that your partners need to work on themselves before they can date you? And we forget that relationships can be the container of finding yourself and learning and exploring with a co-pilot that you feel safe with, safe to take risks and to learn. So really kind of shocking but exciting data that we just released today.
Well, it's so true. I mean, there's, in our area, right there, that just without therapy, being with a secure partner changes your physiology and can convert you. I was thinking young people, in some ways, are so much more informed and educated, and they're already identifying, I'm pansexual, or I'm this, or I'm that, very, very early on. But that also means that there's a lot of pressure on like picking. And then has the other person done enough work? Has the other person, is the other, there's a list versus falling in love and, oops.
Yeah, exactly. We have this list of expectations, and the challenge for our brain in this current moment. We have a list of expectations for us and for our partners. And then if we meet someone who doesn't meet that whole list, we start to think that there's an unlimited resource. The brain thinks you can go on the app or you can go on your phone, you can find 3,000 people before dinner. So you say, well, you're great, but you missed item 19 on my list, so I'm going to go find. And I'm only a little bit sarcastic in when I'm saying this. In fact, we see this happening, that we set our standards so high. The only reason we do that is because the brain is telling us you have more opportunities. The challenge is you get in a loop. We all get in a loop, that we have this sense of an unlimited resource, and we keep reaching for our technology or going to the club or saying, well, I'll find someone who meets all 30 items on my list, because surely if it's an unlimited resource, there'll be someone there who meets all my items. And the reality is you're unlikely to meet someone.
It makes me think of our dopamine conversation about the seeking, right? It's just around the corner. Next time, yeah.
It's like almost like gambling. You just kind of pulling the lever of the slot machine and saying the next round, the next round, the next round. And we can get really caught up. So one of the challenges, I think, for dating today is to, if you're on the dating market, is to remember you want to pull yourself out of this loop of thinking there's an unlimited resource and actually get to know some people, and not necessarily with this preordained list, but get to know people. We found that in our Singles in America study, we found that over 70% of people have become deeply attracted to someone they weren't initially attracted to. That means that feelings of love and connection, it takes time. It takes first dates, second dates, third dates, deeper conversation. That takes getting to know someone, not showing up with a list.
I've been in love twice in my life. And in both cases, any list I would have had, it would have been so inadequate. Like I wouldn't have known to put the things that I fell for on the list. It's limited by my little brain.
Yeah, I love that you say that. Some of the things I love most about my wife is that she pushes me to explore new things, the expansion of self. And I don't know that I would have known that till we were quite in a serious relationship. I remember our first vacation together. We have different vacation styles, and I want to sit on a beach and read a book. And she was like, oh, let's go do this. We're going to go to the cenotes. We're going to go here. We're going to go. I was like, I don't want an excursion, another excursion. And I love it. I was so glad I did it. If she hadn't booked it, I would have just sat there and read the book. And I would have been happy, but a different kind of happiness.
That's right. You didn't know to put that on your list.
I would have never known. Exactly.
So what you're saying, though, is that there has been all this stigma, but you've done all this research. So what's the truth, and particularly for single people, single adults that are choosing to be single?
Yeah. And we're seeing more of those people who are one of the arguments for people who study singles. And I mean, there's now a conference on studying singles, that there are more people who are choosing singlehood. In some cases, there's also more people who are choosing celibacy, we're also seeing. So they're sort of not interested in being in the sexual market. They're not interested in relationships. What some of the studies suggest is that for those who choose singlehood, that as long as they still have close social networks and friendships, they can have pretty high levels of satisfaction, like life satisfaction and happiness. It's kind of hard to measure relationship satisfaction if you're single. It's not really a fair comparison in a research study. But they can still have pretty good mental health outcomes. I mean, traditionally, I guess maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Traditionally, we have found that people in relationships had better health outcomes, physical health, mental health, better life satisfaction, better happiness scores. Increasingly, some researchers are saying, well, you can be single and have all of those things, but you have to have a lot of social support. You have to have a lot of social network. So you sort of break up what maybe was a partnership and you start getting it from your friends and your community. So I think in some ways it's also back to the question of structuring a relationship differently. There are some people who are able to do that, but it takes its own kind of work of reimagining.
Totally. And I'm just thinking, because it's still, a co-pilot does not have to be a romantic partner. It can be your sister, it can be a best friend. And, something in my experience has been that as somebody that has been coupled, having a single friend, like I think of the role socially, it's extremely helpful and lovely. And then when we get separated, it's like a gap, it's a hole. It's very different than two relationships with the kids, the sort of the auntie feel or whatever. Like they're serving something, is the way I am saying it. It's like, I don't know. It's like, feels like it's positively social. You know what I mean?
That you're part of. I mean, we are at our core, we're a social mammal. We want to feel connected. There's a research concept that we call the need to belong, that we want to feel that we're part of something.
Another quick question, just still related to this idea of singles, that I think about, this has just been my experience, single mothers with single children, like with one child, forming those primary partnerships kind of through a lifetime. And I don't know if that's anything that you've thought about or seen in your data or anything about, and what you notice about that or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this is great. We can wrap up on this. I love it. And we did some studies on single parents because the single data set, we've got so many people in our data set over the years that we honed in on a few studies with my colleague, Peter Gray, an anthropologist, and Amanda Gesselman. We've looked at single parents. And what's interesting is when parents talk about when are they going to introduce, if they're dating someone, when they're going to introduce it, there has long been this argument that you want to be cautious with kids about introducing new attachment figures. So if you're dating, like, do you get to a certain point before you introduce partners? That's one of the arguments that actually what we found when we sat down to write these papers has somewhat mixed evidence in the literature, but it makes sense. I think it makes logical sense, but hadn't really been studied all that much. And what we found were that a lot of single parents were not only practicing caution, but a pretty significant number, particularly mothers, single moms, were really looking at how kids were reacting to partners. And that tells us that if you're a single parent, you're negotiating both your own desires, but also this idea that, what are your kids are doing? What is this relationship going to be like? Which adds a whole other element. We also found something that was, at the time, I think, shocking for some folks. We found that single parents, particularly those with young kids, were going on more dates and having more sex. And I remember at first, I shared it with a colleague of ours, and they were like, how? Like, where do you have the time? And what we think was happening, and that's exactly right. If you have young kids, where do you find the time? What we think was happening is if you're a single parent, particularly it was with kids under 2 compared to kids that were older, and then we separated if you had adult kids, that you're more motivated to have a partner. Our species evolved in the context of dual parental care. As anyone who has kids know, doing it with 2 people, doing it was a lot of work. And I was raised by a single mom, It's hard. I mean, I think now as a parent, I think all the time, like, how did you do this, Mom? How did you do this? And my stepfather came along later, which was great, and we have a great relationship. But you just think of, like, how do you? It's so difficult. Well, you're more motivated for partnership. You're more motivated. Some of it psychologically, just to have someone to talk to, that you're not just talking to a baby all day, but also for help, for support, for building a family unit. So we found that. And then after that, we did a series of these studies on single parents. Then we did one for fun on with people who have fur babies and dogs and pets, not to compare kids to have pets. But we were interested in singles who had pets and what they were doing. And what we found was that it was a remarkably similar pattern, that singles with pets were also trying to negotiate, well, when am I going to introduce you to my dog and my cat? And how their pet reacted was really important. So a lot of singles with pets were saying, well, if you don't get along with my cat, that could be a real problem, or my dog. And it was a fun study of thinking really about how if you're single and you have other people in your life, children, parents, or in some cases pets, how we're negotiating. And for me, it was a reminder that we are such a social mammal. I mean, there's not a species on this planet that your family and friends are as involved in mating as the case of humans. And that we are this social mammal, and then our romantic and sexual lives are always couched within these larger social networks.
Thank you very much for all of this information. Tell us again about how people can reach you if they're interested in more, and about your book, where to find your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. We could talk for days and days. We'll talk more. And so for folks who want to follow me, I'm Dr. Justin Garcia on social media. You can also follow the Kinsey Institute at Kinsey Institute. We share a lot of our findings from our research studies across the different faculty and researchers. And then for folks who are interested, my new book is The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love. It's available everywhere, and I share a lot of our research stories and some of my takeaways on how we can use the science of love and sex in our own lives.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much. And I've already got it pre-ordered. Can't wait to see it. And you guys, thank you for listening. If you have found this information valuable, please do rate and review so that other people can find this as well, and share this episode with someone you think will be interested. And in the meantime, appreciate this, again, very generous conversation. And thank you for listening. We'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.